Okay, well, we're ready to go. So thank you again for coming this morning. And today's lecture is on process data and validity. And it's the third of the lecture series this week at CEMO. And I'm very happy that you're here for it. So today we're going to look at validity. And we're going to look at two aspects of validity. One is the use of process data to validate test scores, the interpretation of test scores. And the second part, which I'm going to devote most of the lecture to actually, is about how we validate the use of process data. So that's going to be my main concern today. Now, this is obviously an important area. Partly because process data is what I have described as a relatively new field of inquiry. And I've argued that although the concept of process data has been around for quite a long time, it's a new and innovative field of inquiry, largely because of the movement to the transition to computer-based testing and the associated data techniques and computational techniques that involves. So it's a very exciting, a new area, but one where validation has tended to lag behind. So we've tended to focus on what we can do using process data, but we need to think now about how valid those uses of that data are. So just to recap then on my rather admittedly slightly clumsy working definition of process data. Response process data support the valid and reliable interpretation and use of evidence on the cognitive and affective dimensions of test taking. And of course, then I added the rather clumsy sentence with respect to the temporal, situated, embodied material and interactive characteristics of test performance. However, if we look at the beginning of that definition or that working definition, I had put the words valid and reliable right in there amongst the definition of process data. It supports the valid and reliable interpretation and use. So that's what we're going to focus on today. How do we know that our interpretations, that our inferences that we generate from process data, the uses that we put it to, and the consequences of those uses are valid and reliable, and we might add fair to that set of concerns. And again, to recap, I'd initially identified 4 different uses of process data. In this case, so using the process data to improve test and item design, as validation practice, informing test score interpretations, for quality control and remote proctoring, and lastly, as an extension of the test. And yesterday we discussed the possibility that there are some off-label uses, but this list of 4 at the moment describes what I would regard largely as the valid uses of process data. That's not to say that off-label uses are not valid, but I think they're in a different realm. We have to consider them in a slightly different way, which we discussed yesterday in the lecture. So today I'm going to focus on validation practice, the area highlighted there in yellow, and particularly test score interpretations. So let's look then at process data and validity. So Paul Newton, in a response to one of my papers that he wrote in 2017, posed the question, somewhat playfully, I think, how likely is it that we're on the brink of a revolution in the use of response process evidence within validation research? Well, 2 things there. First of all, I'd like to expand that out from validation research to validation practice, because I think we're now dealing with applications of process data in routine test processes. We're not looking at it as a discrete and separate area of research and development, although there is a research and development component to it. But we're really thinking about how it's applied in routine ways in assessment validation. The second point I'd like to make about Newton's quote there is I feel that we're now well into that revolution. So while in 2017, perhaps it was fair, although I think somewhat playful, to suggest that we might be on the brink, my view is that we're certainly well into that revolution now. If you look at, for example, the literature on computer-based testing, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of publications now about the use of response process evidence. Not all about validation, of course. The second quote there I put is from Layton and colleagues, which makes a similarly good point, I think. Validation arguments require not just the collection of data, but high integrity data, and that every effort should be made to scrutinize the quality of the data gathered. I couldn't agree more, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Of course, we have to bear in mind that it's not just the internal characteristics of that data that gives it integrity from a validity point of view, but how valid are the uses of that data for particular purposes, particular interpretations, and so on. Okay, so the core of a lot of work on using process data for validation is about process model interpretations, and as part of that, task decomposition. And that's, I think, is very nicely captured by the work of Susan Embretson and also the work of Bob Mislevy at ETS. So if we look there at Embretson's quote, construct representation is concerned with identifying theoretical mechanisms that underlie task performance. In short, the goal of construct representation is task decomposition. So that task decomposition model is described in the image on the right-hand side at the top, which I've described in terms of trying to unpack the cognitive processes that connect the item stimulus and task with the item score. So what's happening in that black box? And does it confirm our expectations around construct representation? Do those response processes reflect what our models are, our assumptions are about how people should be engaging with this test in order to capture that construct? Because clearly there can be construct irrelevant sources of variation, which might render the task or item invalid in some way. Okay, and Kane and Mislevy also noting about the importance of the consistency of the response model with the proposed interpretation in terms of the model. So again, it's supporting the approach, I think, very similar to the approach that Susan Embretson takes. Now, on the right-hand side at the bottom there, the lower image is the approach which I have proposed, which is to look at not just cognition, but also affect and the temporal, embodied, material, and interactive characteristics of the testing situation. So those imply, I think, potentially sources of construct irrelevant variation. So they're not going to help us necessarily to validate the construct. In fact, they're there as kind of confounders, as hidden variables, as latent variables, etc., which might upset our analysis. But nevertheless, I think it makes them all the more important to identify what those potential sources of variation are outside of the test construct. So here we come to then what I think is quite a fundamental issue about the nature of process data. And I've talked there about casting the nomological net. The work of Cronbach and Meehl in 1955, and also subsequently, I think the program of research by Embretson, particularly her work in 1983, asks us to really think deeply about the nature of process data and the extent to which process data might be law-like. In other words, what could we expect from process data in terms of consistency, reliability, following law-like characteristics, and our ability to link that process data with wider sources of information and data within and outside the test, around the test construct, but also potentially other constructs and other forms of data. Now, my view might be somewhat controversial here, but as far as I'm concerned, process data is often not law-like. It's often noisy and unruly. There are multiple sources of variation in process data, which are not necessarily relevant to the construct we're trying to assess. But that's the very nature of process data that makes it exciting. Some of that data might be able to help us to understand relationships in a more structured law-like way, but there'll be other characteristics of process data which are irrelevant to the construct, but extremely relevant to questions around the ecology of test taking, test administration, the effective dimensions of test taking, etc. So Goldhammer and Zenner say researchers need to plan thoroughly what kind of process data should be collected and what the temporal and spatial resolution should be. Let me just unpack that. The first part seems quite straightforward. We need to plan thoroughly what kind of process data should be collected. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I would advocate process data by design. In other words, we should, in the design phase of developing tests and items, we should be thinking ahead to the kinds of process data that we would want to collect and for what purposes. So I'd add purpose to Goldhammer and Zenner's sentence there. The emphasis on temporal and spatial resolution, I think, is a good one as well. What are we trying to capture over what time scale and what level of granularity are we looking for? So in relation to that then, the work of Bruno Zumbo, I think, is really quite important. And Bruno wrote a very lovely paper in 2007 around differential item functioning. I would strongly recommend that you read that if you're at all interested in diff-related issues, but also more broadly speaking, in trying to, Bruno's intellectual journey in trying to make sense of the ecology of the testing situation and how it informs, for example, the nature of test scores, but also test process data. So as he says there, and he's describing the generations of diff analysis, he says the third generation of diff is most clearly characterized as conceiving of diff as occurring because of some characteristics of the test item and/or testing situation that is not relevant to the underlying ability of interest, and hence the test purpose. And it's a really important statement, I think, because what it's doing is it's ushering in an era where we say test ecology is really important. And I feel that process data is a key way in which we can tap into the implications of various aspects of that test ecology, the testing situation. Okay, so just going further than that, there are many sources of construct irrelevant variation. One of Samuel Messick's key sources, or the key threats to validity. So it's just to rehearse, is two key sources there were construct underrepresentation and construct irrelevant variation. In terms of construct irrelevant variation, process data is a very nice way to capture and explain those sources of construct irrelevant variation. For me, process data is not about what is reliable and what is law-like, but it's inherently noisy, and our goal should be always to expect the unexpected, to consider that something might be present in the testing situation which would help us to understand the validity of the test and the test scores. So as I said there in a paper that I wrote in 2017 on talk and gestures process data, the purpose of my article was not to introduce interaction, in this case interaction between participants, test administrators and test takers, or interaction between the test taker and, for example, the computer or the computer interface. So I'm not introducing that as a spoiler, as if its mere presence should diminish the validity of standardized tests. And it's not an attempt to introduce epistemological anarchy or to bolster the claims about test fairness or item bias. So rather, following Zumbo's 2007 argument, the article aims to use data on talk and gesture to identify and discuss the sources of variation in assessment performance that can be observed in the testing situation, but that are not necessarily relevant to the trait or construct under investigation. So that's how I would view the importance of process data. So it's not always about what is ruly and what is reliable, but it may be unreliable, unruly, idiosyncratic, and certainly reflecting dimensions of the testing situation that are kind of confounders or at least latent variables in the process data and in our analysis of the validity of the responses. So let me dig a little bit deeper into that. Again, going back to the Goldhammer and Zenner paper. Now they criticize, I think, my own work on PIAC, and I'll just talk a little bit about PIAC and give an example from that. So PIAC is the OECD Adult Skills Assessment. So it's a household-based assessment of adult literacy and numeracy and problem solving. And what they argue, what Goldhammer and Zenner argue, is that the approach that I've taken, there are no mechanisms to systematically evoke talk or gesture. Instead, the interviewer serves as a support and primarily responds to the body language and verbal utterances to assess the respondent's questions and problems. Here, process data is collateral information. And I love that idea that they're proposing there is collateral information. Of course, what they're suggesting there is my collection of process data in naturalistic observation is opportunistic and idiosyncratic. And they're absolutely right. But to suggest that it's collateral, I'm not sure that that is correct. In fact, I would argue in some ways that I was just as purposive and planned in my collection of process data as they are in the collection of log data. And I want to give some examples now of why that might be the case. So I feel that what I'm doing in naturalistic observation, for example, is rigorous data collection. But we can't be guaranteed that that data is going to cover every eventuality and every performance. It's likely to be partial and idiosyncratic, for sure. That's the nature of process data, I think, if we look at multimodal data. So let me look now at some process data from the OECD PIAC assessment, which I collected in Slovenia, in the PIAC assessment in Slovenia. So here's a short transcript from between an interviewer and a respondent. So PIAC is interviewer administered. So they do a background questionnaire, and then they hand over in computer-based testing. They hand over the computer to the participant. They also have in previous cycles the opportunity for paper-based assessment. So you have some mode equivalence issues there. So here we have the interviewer saying, I can't see where, and it's because the respondent is asked for some help. Yes, how far I am? Yes, pardon? I don't know. A question, the second exercise, is there still much to go? And then the interviewer says, I never know the precise number of questions. I see. So that, yes, okay, yes. Are you tired? Yes, well, so. Now, the reason why they don't know the precise number of questions is it's computer administered and it's adaptive. So yes, the interviewer is correct there. They don't know the precise number of questions. So what's going on there is that the interviewer is teasing out something about the effective dimensions of the testing situation. Are you tired? So they're using the question about, how much is there to go with the question about whether the person's tired. So we're introducing the concept of fatigue there. And fatigue in low stakes assessments such as PIAC can be quite a big issue because as people proceed through the test, fatigue is clearly construct irrelevant, but it can impact on responses. So here we have now a example of that particular test event with that particular respondent, and it's a section of log data which relates to that particular moment when the interviewer and respondent had that conversation. So it's a section of tidied up log data from this particular test item, and the test item was called contact employer. You can look in the technical report and you'll see the item reference number there. So what we've got here in the log data is at a particular moment in time, 10, 15, 41 seconds, the stimulation and questions were loaded. And then we have a click, a number of highlight events, another click, submitting the answer, and then the item end. So we have some very interesting temporal dimensions here. We know how long this took. We can say exactly how long this item took, and we can know the number of clicks where it took place. However, what we don't know in the log data, now I should say this very systematic log data, the log data is collected and analyzed in a very systematic way by advocates, people who use log data. But it's missing something really very important that we found out from the observations of the interview. In other words, there was fatigue setting in the interview situation. The person seems to complete this item. They load the question, they do the right number of clicks, they do the highlighting tasks which were important for this item, which were necessary, and then they submit their answer. So it looks straightforward from a log data point of view. However, now let's look at the data from the retrospective think aloud from a cognitive interview. And in this case, it's between me and the respondent. Now, I'd been observing the testing situation and also video recording. And then I was able to ask, when there was too much text, did you ever give up and skip? Just press advance? Okay, now you might think that's a loaded question, but I'd been observing and taking notes. So rigorous observation. And I was able to know that I could see from the body language and the performance that something was going on in relation to fatigue. So the respondent says, I think here in this one, and she means contact employer, the item where we have the log data displayed here. So we have a triangulation here, we could say, between the observations, my note taking, the log data, and the data from the retrospective think aloud. So there's some strong evidence that's coming together here around fatigue in this item. And then I say, in that one, yeah. And she says, confirms, in that one. Any else? I don't know. Maybe I just, yeah, here. You skipped any others? I don't know. Maybe one, maybe one. So, I mean, what I'd seen in the particular observation of the testing situation is that fatigue was beginning to set in, but also this person was taking time out from work. So the assessment was taking place during her working day, during her lunch hour, and she was perhaps getting a little bit concerned about the amount of time it was taking, and perhaps getting a bit fatigued as well, or perhaps even a bit hungry. In fact, after the assessment, she made me and my colleagues some very nice Slovenian bean soup, which was delicious. But just to go on there with the retrospective think aloud, I followed on. You had to concentrate. Maybe it wasn't so exciting. You still concentrated, and yeah, I tried, but maybe in one or two cases I just, what's the word for osancity? Highlighted? Yes, highlighted, and I didn't care if it's true. Oh, I see. So you just finished? Yeah. Just highlighted a bit and then pressed advance. Yeah. So here we have what you might say is a bit of a smoking gun there about the role of construct irrelevant variance in this particular testing situation. So it helps us to understand what's going on in the testing situation that might lead to, for example, somebody skipping a test item. Now, there is data in PIAC, in the technical report, etc., on, for example, how likely it is for people to skip items. But I would just like to point out from a log data point of view, this is not a skipped item. The person submits an answer. They highlight a piece of text and they press click. However, what the retrospective think aloud tells us is something really quite important. In other words, there was a way using computer-based assessment for them to submit an answer, in this case, highlight and click submit, without really caring if it was true. And similarly, people might, in multiple choice questions, choose an option and press click, even if they didn't know what the answer was. And of course, there's work there around response times and how that might inform that important work that Goldhammer and colleagues are doing around those kind of features of performance. So now I'm going to give an example which expands on that a little bit, very briefly, about the importance of the testing situation, the test ecology in our understanding of test performance. And it's a short animation I'm going to show you now. Okay, so that animation then, and you can see it there on followed up on your own if you want. It's on Vimeo. Highlights, I think, some of the spatial, temporal, interactive aspects of the testing situation from an ecological point of view. Now, clearly, the child playing, the child wanting food, is not something that test designers build into their design. It's not construct relevant, but you can see from the animation, which is based on observations, that the role of children, the presence of children in the household, can really impact on the process data, let's say, if not the test scores in the testing situation in PIAC. And so it puts a lot of demands on the test administrator to ensure that that does not disturb the outcome of the test in terms of product or score. Certainly in my observations in PIAC and Slovenia, and in other household-based assessments, there's often a great deal of interest in the presence of the assessment team and of the assessment itself. And I have witnessed many occasions where family members sit next to the test taker because they're interested in the test. It's an interesting, engaging test, and they want to see what's going on. And in some cases, they offer support, and the interviewer has to ask them not to offer that support and to let the test taker who's selected to complete the test. So it's important ecological information. All right then, so to conclude, what I want to do is spend a little moment just before we finish looking at questions about the rigor, the ad hoc or rigor nature of process data and multimodal process data in particular. So again, going back to Goldhammer and Zenner, in their paper, they suggest a more rigorous approach rather than an ad hoc approach to collecting process data. And I think by more rigorous, what they seem to be suggesting is automated collection analysis of the data. As an anthropologist, I feel that what I do in observing situations in situ is a rigorous approach towards the collection of process data. What they seem to be suggesting is technological fixes to allow us to build technological systems where we automate the collection of that data. And in this quote towards the end of their paper, they say, with video information, facial expressions of the test person could be automatically classified by facial action coding system, by the facial action coding system. And they quote the work of Ekman and colleagues there. Similarly, to know how the system is used in the intelligent tutoring system, AutoTutor, de Mello and Grazer, This way, frustration, engagement, and fatigue could be identified. So what they're really suggesting there is that we move from, let's say, a qualitative ad hoc approach to a systematic automated system. Now, that might sound quite good in terms of the rigorous collection of process data. However, as an anthropologist, I would beg to differ. I think what they seem to be introducing there in the desire to automate the collection of process data is some major sources of error. And let me just look at what those might be. So first of all, if we look at the collection and analysis, the automated collection analysis of emotional data from facial expressions, what we find is a very controversial field. And in a very rigorous and extensive review of the literature on video-based analysis of emotions from facial expressions, Barrett and colleagues in 2019 conclude that those uses of video data are actually inherently very problematic and flawed. Because, and one of the major reasons is that very often facial expressions are a part of social interaction. So we don't just do them with a machine, but we do them with other people. But more importantly, people don't always express their felt emotions through facial expressions. And what they pointed out is very often what we think are typical facial expressions, for example, for happiness, coyness, or desire, are actually stereotypes, so popular stereotypes that people have for our understanding of facial expressions. So for example, when I'm hungry or when I think that something looks tasty, I don't always lick my lips and stick my tongue out. In fact, I think that kind of behavior is probably more characteristic of very young children who lack self-regulation. I think most people would not stick their tongue out. And similarly, when I'm happy, I don't often smile. I may smile to indicate happiness to somebody else. But very often, for example, if I'm happy when I'm doing a computer-based assessment or looking at something online, I wouldn't be smiling. And so it's quite flawed. The idea that there's a direct correspondence between emotional states and facial expressions, as Barrett and al. Have argued, is really very problematic and flawed. Now, they say in their paper that they still recommend it as a valuable area of research, but that we have to seriously, what they say, step back from our assumptions and think about what we know about reading emotions from faces. The implication of that, I think, for automated collection of facial expression data in assessment is that we need to be very careful about the validity of that data and our interpretations and uses of that data. I think it can be clearly very problematic, particularly if we look at cross-cultural data, where there can be sources of error which are integral to, for example, the software, which may be more or less reliable with different cultural groups and with different skin colors, but also the introduction of cross-cultural variation in how people communicate their emotions. And that these are topics that Barrett and colleagues have discussed. So one source of automation, I think, is potentially quite problematic from a validity point of view. Then if we go into the literature on mind wandering, and that relates to Zener and Goldhammer's comments about the work of DeMello and colleagues. DeMello and colleagues have produced some very interesting work looking at how we can use eye tracking data to make judgments about whether people are remaining engaged in computer-based reading tasks, for example. However, and there is a literature that's quite well developed, including the work of DeMello and others, around mind wandering and how we can capture that mind wandering in an automated way to inform and improve the quality of online instruction and assessment. But again, when we get into the literature on mind wandering, if we look at the recent literature over the last few years, there's been a major revision in the theories about mind wandering. And in fact, many people would argue that the assumptions that if somebody is engaged with a task, that the eye movements remain fixed on in that particular point in the text is actually flawed. One of the reasons why they say it's flawed is that very often they argue is that when people are completing cognitive tasks, they're involved in a range of cognitive activities, which can be captured in neuroscience and other techniques that demonstrate quite clearly that people will use, for example, recall, imagination, creativity, that don't always involve looking at the text. In fact, quite the opposite. Sometimes, in order to create space in our working memories for creativity and thinking, we look away from the text, not because we're disengaged, but because it's an integral part of engagement. So again here, Fabry and Kukkonen, in their review paper and a number of other recent papers, have asked us to think very carefully about the validity of using, for example, eye tracker data as evidence of engagement in that way. Of course, there are other ways to use eye tracking data, but I would question whether that sort of automated software-based system is actually valid and reliable. So those are just a couple of examples. There are many more where we could look at the challenges of validating the quality and use of process data. So let me now just come to some conclusions. My first conclusion then is that process data is indeed an important and valuable source of information on assessment validity, particularly in adaptive computer-based designs, where process data is treated as a kind of performance data. And I think we've looked at in particular, the first part, for example, in evidence-based design, where that process data could be really integral to good assessment design. The second point, which I've made in the second part of this lecture, is that the interpretation and uses of process data requires validation. It requires validation itself. So it's not just about how we use process data to validate, but the actual process data requires validation. And that requires the development of validation arguments, evidence, and procedures. And it's largely uncharted territory. So there are a number of people, I think, including Goldhammer and Zenner, who are working on this area, but really the number of published papers on it at the moment is very limited. So it's an area where it's clearly important, but lacking development to support it. The third point there that I've tried to make is that process data is inherently unruly. So it's not law-like, and it doesn't always support our expectations that it should be orderly, manageable, and construct relevant, which is why I'd said always expect the unexpected in process data. We should be looking for the unexpected. We should be looking, for example, at how ecological factors might impact on people's response processes, or how idiosyncratic features that we don't anticipate in the testing situation might impact on it. Fourthly, there are many threats to the validity of process data. We might look at partiality and missing data, latent and hidden variables, sources of mismeasure, and we have theoretical and software-related threats to validity. In other words, we can build into software certain theoretical assumptions, which, as I've shown here, may well be flawed and problematic. The last point, and I think it's an important one, is that the diversity in test-taking populations must be taken into account. And very often when people think about process data, they think about it based on maybe lab data with a small sample, perhaps from one cultural context and group. But there can be a lot of legitimate sources of variation. In other words, construct relevant sources of variation in tested populations relating to the cultural and educational experience of the test taker, variations in personality, neurodiversity, and disability. And so that's a major challenge when we start to validate the use of process data, because we're dealing with something that's inherently noisy, unruly, and prone to variation as a result of legitimate sources of diversity. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll finish there.